Title II: The Transformation of American Politics and the Cultural Project of Conservatism. Before delving into why this consolidation of political forces became possible and its intrinsic connection to the rise of conservatism, one must acknowledge another unintended consequence brought about by the new social movements: the cultural shift in political competition. As previously discussed, since the 1960s, political mobilization in the United States has gradually moved away from traditional class divides and begun to center around issues of identity, such as gender, sexual orientation, and race, that had previously remained on the periphery of democratic discourse. This shift, in a progressive sense, expanded the concept of citizenship, securing equal rights for a broader range of marginalized groups. However, the challenge lies in that, once these marginalized identities gained access to political resources and mobilizing power, the associated social groups, various social movement organizations, and the Democratic Party itself tended to reinforce these identities rather than integrate them into a more inclusive framework of citizenship. This path dependency on identity politics ultimately led left-wing politics to shift from focusing on traditional valence issues to position issues. Valence issues refer to topics that can garner broad consensus across different groups, grounded in a universal sense of citizenship, such as improving welfare systems or promoting economic development, capable of uniting a broad political coalition. Position issues, on the other hand, are closely tied to specific identities and values, such as support for abortion or the recognition of same-sex marriage. These issues often provoke strong ideological divisions, polarizing social groups into opposing camps. In this context, identity, discourse, and values gradually took center stage in public discussions, overshadowing practical concerns about economic interests and social welfare. In other words, after the 1970s, the operational logic of American politics was largely reshaped by left-wing social movements. The focus of political competition shifted from the distribution of resources to the distribution of values, fundamentally transforming the overall political landscape. This shift was initially driven by the liberal left and the Democratic Party. Interestingly, however, after the 1970s, conservatism and the Republican Party quickly adopted and even surpassed this strategy. This was not a coincidence. In fact, the left's challenge stemmed from its own success. The entrenchment of identity politics led to another consequence, fragmenting the liberal left along diverse marginalized identities. Different factions and organizations became focused on single issues, lacking unified action and sustained cooperation. Although the Occupy Wall Street movement was a notable exception with significant momentum, it too ultimately failed to translate into enduring institutional outcomes. In contrast, the resurgence of conservatism after the 1970s, by standing in opposition to all marginalized identities, found it easier to form a unified stance and demonstrated a stronger capacity for political mobilization. New evangelical churches, conservative social organizations, and the Republican Party astutely tapped into the pervasive resentment among the lower and middle classes, constructing a value narrative imbued with cultural identity and a sense of transcendence. This identity narrative portrays a quintessential figure, typically a white male who has been marginalized by recent political and social changes, casting him as a victim of sorts. Yet, this identity has not diminished his sense of moral superiority or loyalty to the American nation. He values family and community and sees it as his mission to save America, to revive what is viewed as decayed traditional values, to rebuild a fractured market and free society, to restore past glory, and to reclaim a sense of justice and order. To borrow the words of renowned left-wing columnist Thomas Frank in describing this cultural strategy of conservatism, he argues that this strategy seems to create a parallel world for conservative supporters, a world filled with various pseudo-spiritual products that can replace mainstream left-wing values. It's almost like the absurd dream of someone burned out. Frank's assessment is half correct. This is indeed a parallel world constructed within the realm of imagination, a dream, but it is far from the fleeting and absurd illusion Frank suggests. Instead, it is a dream shared by nearly half of the American populace for almost 3 decades. To some extent, this new dream has already replaced the traditional old American dream of equal opportunity and inclusive diversity. For these Americans, the old Gilded Age and the dream it represented ended long ago, swept away by the cultural reversal of the 1960s and the challenges that marginalized identities posed to mainstream status. The reason this new American dream has managed to retain such strong cohesion in the highly fragmented post-industrial era and successfully unify a broad political coalition across social classes likely relates to two key factors. Firstly, this new American dream, or more accurately, this entire discourse system, brings transcendent moral values and cultural identity to the forefront, cleverly masking the underlying economic and political agenda of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism encompasses several core policy initiatives: radical market-oriented reforms, tax cuts, especially for higher-income groups and corporations, deregulation across various industries, and the downsizing of the welfare state. From the United States to other parts of the world, economic practices over the past 30 years have shown that this policy framework has proven harmful to most lower-income groups and segments of the middle class, often exacerbating income inequality, increasing unemployment rates, and weakening the social welfare safety net. Precisely the deep economic roots of the feelings of deprivation and resentment among these American citizens. However, under the allure of a well-packaged moral agenda and cultural identity, these lower and middle-class citizens have effectively chosen a political stance that goes against their true economic interests, aligning themselves with an alliance that includes the upper middle class, the capitalist elite, and conservative political elites. Moreover, because neoliberal economic policies are closely intertwined with conservative moral narratives, these citizens often evaluate economic performance through an ideological lens, overlooking many unfavorable cases and counterexamples. As Mark Smith has pointed out, despite the fact that on average U.S. economic performance has been slightly better during Democratic administrations than Republican ones since the 1970s, the public perception consistently favors Republicans as being more adept at managing and fostering economic growth. Secondly, the realization of this new American dream also involves an extensive organizational and institutional project, encompassing the restructuring of intra- and extra-party organizational frameworks, changes in fundraising models, the development and dissemination of a cohesive discourse, innovations in communication methods, adjustments in mobilization strategies, expansion of platforms for narrative dissemination, and a redefinition of the relationship between the party and various social organizations. In most of these areas, the Republican Party and conservative organizations have outperformed their liberal left counterparts. For instance, prior to the 1960s and 1970s, U.S. political mobilization largely depended on a complex network of local grassroots organizations, a labor-intensive model requiring substantial human resources. However, with the advent of television and later internet technology, advances in media dissemination, and the increasing professionalization and specialization of grassroots operations, political mobilization has gradually transformed into a capital-intensive endeavor. In this context, the Republican Party and conservative groups have held a distinct advantage due to greater support from corporate donations and conservative foundations. Although capital also flows toward the Democratic Party, it tends to focus on specific candidates with strong chances of winning, rather than investing in building the grassroots organizational capacity and institutional foundation of the Democratic Party. Moreover, conservatism swiftly established new platforms for disseminating its discourse. Beginning in the 1970s, conservative foundations were among the first to recognize and leverage a highly impactful organizational model, the think tank. Through these seemingly neutral and scientific channels, think tanks became effective advocates for conservative economic ideas. At this time, the most influential think tanks were almost all aligned with conservative ideology, including institutions like the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, and the Heritage Foundation. These think tanks served the Republican Party much in the same way that progressive social organizations once bolstered the Democratic Party's political dominance. For instance, the relationship between the Republican Party and social movements has also undergone a significant transformation. Particularly over the past decade, there has been a surge in so-called grassroots movement organizations as well as astroturf organizations, groups that appear to be spontaneous grassroots efforts but are, in fact, supported by Republican resources and directed by its agenda. Even the Tea Party movement, which once swept across the United States, was no exception. The core objective of these strategies is to make conservatism appear as if it has a broader social base while diversifying and enhancing the effectiveness of the Republican Party's mobilization channels. Essentially, these tactics mimic and ultimately co-opt the social legitimacy traditionally enjoyed by left-wing movements, demonstrating a highly sophisticated strategy. Title 3: The Nature and Future of the Trump Administration. In short, since the wave of new social movements, the basic mindset of the American public and the structure of political alliances have undergone a fundamental transformation. Consequently, the liberal left unexpectedly facilitated its own decline, weakening its original social and political base. In contrast, the conservative movement more successfully adapted to the cultural shift in American politics and created a new American dream, rooted in resentment, transcendent moral values, and cultural identity. This new dream masks the political and economic agenda behind it, while being sustained by a powerful organizational infrastructure. However, to see Trump merely as another Reagan or Bush would be an oversimplification. Trump is fundamentally a shrewd opportunist, a fact evident from his frequent shifts in party affiliation over the past decade. His alignment with the Republican Party is, at best, superficial, as he was neither the party elite's chosen candidate nor a political figure groomed by emergent plutocratic networks like the Koch network. In fact, the Koch network's preferred candidate has consistently been Paul Ryan. Trump's success lies largely in his role as a political outsider, allowing him to make promises without constraint, intensifying and amplifying the conservative-constructed new dream to unprecedented heights. Consequently, the inherent contradictions within this new dream, the divergence between its moral rhetoric and political promises, and the underlying political-economic agenda, have become even more pronounced and irreconcilable. In the near future, the Trump administration could face one of two typical trajectories. The first possibility is that, due to layers of constraints from Congress and various checks within the party, it will remain unable to reconcile the inherent contradictions between its moral rhetoric and its political-economic agenda. This would lead to administrative inefficiencies, tightened national finances, and difficulties in implementing policies, gradually eroding public support. In this scenario, Trump may likely be absorbed by the established elite networks within the Republican Party or, at the very least, be co-opted by emerging political networks like the Koch network, thus reverting to a traditional party-driven mode of political operation. In fact, Trump already lacks sufficient political resources and an expert team to handle the complex and extensive task of policy reform, making him inevitably reliant on external resources to fill this gap. According to previous reports, his former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, was trained within the Koch network's premier political organization, Americans for Prosperity, which further deepens his potential ties to the Koch network. The second possibility is that Trump could emulate Louis Bonaparte from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, using a rogue-style political approach to gradually suppress major social groups and politico-economic elites, including the old elites within traditional parties and financial powers on Wall Street. Through intense political struggle and internal discord, he may steadily accumulate political capital and power, leveraging popular support to steer the United States in an increasingly conservative direction, even with a possibility, albeit remote, of moving toward authoritarianism. While the U.S. system of checks and balances is designed to prevent such outcomes, it's worth noting that presidential power has indeed expanded over time, from Lincoln to Roosevelt to Reagan.